Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following a few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow.
Hello, thank you for joining us at the Humanist Perspective. Today I brought back Henri Chandler to talk about a new topic of citizens without nations. Henri Chandler is our historical aggregator and a good friend of mine. Welcome, Henri. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, so our topic today is about citizens without nations. Can you want to introduce the topic, Henri?
Yeah. So okay, there's a new book that just came out, and this is the book right here. It's called Citizens Without Nations, and it's on the subject of the role of city-states and free cities in the development of the concept of citizenship, and how that has contributed to our current ideas of citizenship, and also how it changed in the last couple hundred years.
Right. Yeah. This is a topic that me and Henri have been talking about for a long time, since I've known him. It's a topic that's interesting in and of itself because it's a kind of a unique period of history, and maybe not so unique, but it's an interesting part of European history that we don't really normally think of as part of European history. But it also has interesting implications to our ideals of citizenry today and our ideals of how we look at the state. Would that be a characterization?
Yeah, and one of the points this guy makes in this book is that it actually does also exist in some places outside of Europe historically. It's probably the most Europe is the most important center of this kind of city-state phenomenon, but they also find them in the Middle East, in East Asia, and they also occurred in the New World to some extent. Okay. So it's a little bit broader of a phenomenon and deeper of a phenomenon than a lot of people have thought about. Most people think of city-states in ancient Greece or something like that, but it went on for a long time in various forms.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's a good point. And what is the context of this book is being written in? Would you say is
Yeah. So for a long time, any knowledge about this kind of stuff outside of ancient Greece, say, or maybe like the early stage of the Roman Empire before it became an empire, is not very well known in English. There are pretty good academic studies of some of this phenomenon in different parts of the world, but they're mostly in other languages because they didn't have so much of this in England. So our concept of history before the industrial age is largely comes through the filter of the English, and whatever they weren't interested in or didn't focus on, in the United States we tend to have a little less than whatever they knew, and therefore we just kind of missed it. But the UK has been in competition economically with Germany and with several other states in Europe, and they have been trying to figure out for a while how to match Germany in training workers. And the Germans still rely on essentially kind of a modern incarnation of a medieval apprenticeship system, which goes back to craft guilds in the Middle Ages. And because of that, the English suddenly got interested in that phenomenon. And so the London School of Economics financed a bunch of studies about 15 years ago. There was a professor called Stephen Epstein that was out of the London School of Economics, and he kind of sponsored a bunch of other scholars in Italy and Holland and a bunch of other parts of Europe, and also in Turkey and some other places. And A bunch of papers were the result. And the fellow that wrote this book is a professor from Holland, from the Netherlands, who was part of that original sort of wave of study. And they really changed the perception about craft guilds at that time, and revised the idea that craft guilds were purely negative. So pretty much almost any 20th century philosopher or 19th century philosopher on economics or politics hate craft guilds.
Right.
Karl Marx.
Let's go back and talk about what craft guild is, because most people probably know what a craft guild is.
Okay,
just in case.
Yeah, good point. So most people have heard the word guild. They don't necessarily know what it means.
It's popular in gaming culture right now. So
right, yeah, I always kind of forget about that. But here in New Orleans, we have something called a social aid and pleasure club, which is actually a form of a guild. It's what they would technically call a confraternity, or the Catholic Church calls it a sodality. But these would be the social part of a working association. Like one of the social aid and pleasure clubs here is called the Black Men of Labor. That's a reference to the tie-in to usually a craft, and the craft would be by industry. So maybe you have carpenters, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, etc. Right. So almost any kind of usually production, but also services can be made into craft guild. And a craft guild is distinct from a merchant's guild or like a carnival association that might also be essentially a guild. It's more of a social guild or a religious. Right. So there's a lot of different kinds of guilds. The craft guilds were the basis and were the sort of the managing strata of a lot of manufacturing in Europe a long time ago, and to some extent there's still remnants of it that plays a role in a lot of countries like Italy and Germany and Holland too a little bit.
And what happened to England where it didn't develop that tradition, or maybe they did and got stamped out?
Well, England, unlike a lot of the rest of Europe, which in the center and in Italy and Flanders where the Renaissance really started, those were kind of ironically what we might call a failed state. Italy was basically similar to a failed state in the sense that there was no one country there. In fact, there was no one country in Italy until the 1880s. And same thing in Germany. Germany was what we called the Holy Roman Empire, and it was something like 1,000 little countries. And of that 1,000 little countries, there was about a couple hundred free cities. And in Flanders, there was some kind of a quasi-state in the Low Countries in Belgium, what's now Belgium and Holland, but they were dominated by these city-states. So they happened in places where there was either kind of weak states or no state at all. England was trying to create a kingdom very, very hard for a long time, and when it came to a rivalry between a city like London or York in England and the king wasn't going to tolerate that. So that the independence of the cities in England sort of diminished. Never completely went away, but it really declined at the end of the 14th century. And they never really got urbanized as a result. So you didn't have their Renaissance hit 200 years later after it had already happened in Italy. Shakespeare is 200 years after Dante, or almost 300. So
is that what a free city is? Is it just a city that has a lot of its autonomy, or is it more deeper than that?
Yeah. So a city-state is a city that is completely autonomous. It's like it's its own little country. So ancient Athens was a city-state. And sometimes they'll also own territory around where the city is itself. Sometimes they just own the city. Whereas a free city is essentially a similar thing, but they're inside the context of a weak state. So it's not that there's no state. In Central Europe, there was a Holy Roman Emperor. He just didn't really have any real authority. He could call everybody together if, say, France invaded or something. But other than that, at any given time, he's struggling with a bunch of other dukes and barons and whatnot, and he doesn't really have a lot of power. So a free city lives in that weak state environment, but they still basically run all their affairs. They have their own government. They have their own army, and some of them still did until quite late.
How late?
Well, the last one in Central Europe, in Germany, was the city of Lübeck, which used to be basically the epicenter of the Hanseatic League, which was a big trading cartel in the Middle Ages. And they still had their own sort of an army. It was kind of basically they were just like police, you might say, or sort of like state troopers.
Right.
But it was technically their army, and that was abolished in 1936 after they refused to let Adolf Hitler speak in the city. And so then, right after that, the Nazis passed a law taking away all the last of their rights, and they emphasized all of the maritime production and everything that was going on in that region to Hamburg. So Hamburg grew a lot bigger. But then during the course of the war, Hamburg got incinerated by British bombers. And so Lübeck's still kind of like a little fairy tale town today because all the 15th century architecture is still there. So they were correct in not letting Hitler speak.
Yeah, it ends up working out for them.
Even though they lost their rights. And they're back to calling themselves the free and Hanseatic city of Lübeck now. So who knows, you know.
Okay, that's a good overview of free cities. And when they, so how would free cities like run their own internal affairs? And did they have like treaties with other free cities, or at least with the state, on how they could operate?
Yeah, technically they had them. And one of the things that's really weird about the Holy Roman Empire in particular, it makes it hard to understand, is that there was all these competing legal systems that didn't necessarily acknowledge each other or make sense in the same context. So a lot of times there'd be some duke or maybe an archbishop. Some of your audience may not like archbishops in particular. A lot of times there'd be an archbishop that thought he owned the city. For example, in Strasbourg, they built this huge cathedral. The little city of 30,000 people built this cathedral that was taller than the pyramids in the early 1400s. But by the time they finished the cathedral, the archbishop was no longer allowed in the city. He'd been permanently banned. And that was very common.
And that was by the city?
By the city authorities, yeah. So the city government is made up of essentially everybody that has an economic stake in the city. So all your craftspeople and your merchants, and then some of your professionals and stuff. And that a lot of times would vary by city, and it would depend on what kind of government, whether the merchants were more in charge or whether the craft guilds, the artisans, were more in charge. But it might be about half of the people that lived in the city actually had citizenship, and they're the ones that have to pay taxes. And then everybody else that is a resident of the city doesn't have citizenship, so they can't vote on things and so on.
And don't have to pay taxes.
And don't have to pay taxes. Yeah, it was considered a privilege to pay taxes.
Right.
Ironically.
Now, I remember when we early on in our conversations about this, you were saying that it was like scholarship was just becoming familiar with how widespread the free cities were. Like you would have a book that was written about the free cities, and they would say, "Oh, look how unique this city is," and they find out, actually, that's a charter that they got from another free city.
Yeah.
So how recent is this discovery in academia?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a recent discovery in academia, but it's becoming much more understood in English-speaking academia.
Is that what it is?
And part of what the phenomenon that you're referring to is that each country in Europe, they're very nationalistic, you know.
Right.
So every country in Europe, you go to Slovakia, and they're going to say, well, we have these marvelous cities that produce all this incredible artwork,
right,
unlike the rest of Europe, and then they'll just basically repeat whatever the Americans say because they're influenced by, you know, U.S. media.
Right.
It's really weird. And so they think everybody else was like medieval caveman, like you see in every genre movie or fiction, you know, Game of Thrones or something. But we were different, you know.
Right.
And then right next to them, the Czechs will say that, you know, they think the Slovakians were just like bums like everybody else, and they were special. And then right next to them, you know, the Poles and so on. And so gradually, it's
each one has their exceptionalism.
Exactly, yeah. And so eventually, what you're talking about with the charters, we started piecing that together, and there started to be some books that really put it all together outside of just one country. But it's hard because most people that do studies want to focus on one country, right? And they all follow different rules. So like I'm more familiar with Central Europe, so that's kind of what I'm referring to. But the most important city-states did play by slightly different rules, and that was in Italy, where they were separate states. So in Central Europe, and in the Czech area, for example, which was a kingdom technically, or Holy Roman Empire, which was you know neither holy nor Roman or an empire, to paraphrase Voltaire, but was technically a country. In fact, in one sense, it was technically a kingdom. They supposedly had a king. But in Italy, they had thrown out the last would-be king in like 1150, and so there was no king down there. There was the Pope, who had some power in certain areas, like it had his own armies and everything. Right. But then there was all these city-states, which is great for the city-states, and they became really powerful and influential, but they also fought each other,
Right.
which kind of led to their downfall, because eventually, as so much of the money in Europe went to Italy because the Italians were making 10 times better stuff than everybody else, and their merchant fleet was reaching, they were going all the way to China. Marco Polo got to China in the 13th century. And in the 14th century, the Genoese had permanent bases in western China. And so they were getting all the silk and the pepper and everything that everybody wanted. But then the kingdoms, the places that had sort of a quasi-state, like Spain and France, got very interested in where all their money was going. And they followed their money with their armies into Italy, and it started creating a lot of problems for the Italian city-states.
And if they would have been more unified, they may have been able to fight them off.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in fact, originally they were unified, and they created this thing called the Lombard League, and they fought off the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, who was apparently a pretty tough guy, and they eventually defeated him. And that was really when the original proto-Renaissance took off. It was right after they basically threw that guy out, and all those towns that you hear so much about, Venice and Milan and Florence and Siena and Genoa and whatnot, that are famous to this day, their fame started being created at that time, almost instantly. And then the third really important area is the Low Countries, which is Belgium and Holland. And for a long time, they were under the rule of a rival to the King of France, a member of his own family, the Valois family of France, which was the Dukes of Burgundy. And they managed to walk a fine line for a while where they didn't squash the cities, and they were able to get some money out of the cities, but they were always fighting with them. Several of the Dukes of Burgundy, for example, at one point or another got held captive by one of the cities, like Ghent in particular, which was run by the craft guilds and was very revolutionary. But they were able to walk that fine line for a long time, and as a result, they were super rich, and they were able to sort of fight with France because they were so wealthy. And everybody's heard of the 100 Years' War in Joan of Arc here in New Orleans. And Burgundy was the rival. Burgundy were the ones that killed Joan of Arc.
Right.
Who they looked at as a religious fanatic.
Right. Not wrong. But so the concept of citizen was attached to the city that you lived in at the time, and as I understand it, that's changed during the French Revolution. I'm curious back then, though, like what did rural people think that weren't living in the cities, and what were their kind of allegiance?
That's a good question. So that really varied from place to place. There's some places where the cities were like a lord. So, for example, when I was in the Army, I was stationed in a little city called Ulm. And Ulm was apparently a fairly ruthless overlord to a lot of the Bavarian, Swabian peasants around where they were at. But in other places, the town and the peasants had an alliance. Strasbourg, for example, they were at the end of the 100 Years' War, after the French and the Burgundians and English were all fighting each other. The French were trying to figure out what to do with their mercenary army and get them out of France because they were just causing endless mayhem. So the Dauphin of France got the idea to send his Armagnac mercenaries into Switzerland, where there was what's called the Swiss Confederacy, which was sort of a loose confederation of some peasants and some free cities, Bern and Zurich in particular, who were very tough little cities. He encountered the Swiss and lost a bunch of guys, lost most of his cavalry, so he decided not to go up into the mountains, and he was going to overwinter in Strasbourg. And there was a big war between him and the city, but 7,000 peasants were allowed to go behind the walls of Strasbourg and hide it out because the army was running around robbing everybody, killing people and stuff. They were known as skinners because they skinned people alive. Mm. And Strasbourg ended up beating them, so it was all good. And I did an article about it because I was trying to figure out if Gutenberg was there at the time. But the most interesting relationship like that, though, to me, was Hamburg. Their Elbe River went through this big marsh that was populated by some peasants that had a peasant republic that was called the Dithmarschen. They're mostly Frisian, which is a type of, they're like kind of a variation on Dutch people, or a regional group of Dutch. And their language sounds a lot like ours. There's a funny video on YouTube where Eddie Izzard tries to talk to them in Old English. He tries to buy a cow from a Frisian guy. But anyway, they were kind of aligning with the pirates a lot in the region, and they would make an industry out of collecting wrecked ships and all the barrels that come off the ships. It's sort of like a shipping container.
Right.
And it was important to them, part of their economy, and they started drifting toward allying with pirates that were against Hamburg. Hamburg had a couple of wars with them, but a lot of the regional dukes and stuff used to try to go to war with those people, and they would lose because they would go into the marsh and they would flood all the levees and wipe out all these armies. And Hamburg realized that it was a bad idea, and so they made a deal to make them the Coast Guard. And that group of peasants was the only non-city that was allowed into the Hanseatic League as a result. So they were they were the Hamburg Coast Guard for a long time.
So this all changed during the French Revolution, the identity.
Yeah,
of
it kind of started changing before that. It peaked in the Middle Ages, and after the Middle Ages, one of the things that happened was that there was two major things that happened in Europe: was the religious split between the Protestants and the Catholics, and also the arrival of syphilis, which Europeans had no immunity to, and it was rotting people's noses off and stuff, and sometimes in just a matter of weeks. It was insane, and it really affected. People thought they were under a scourge of God, and it helped people believe in the religion a lot more. Like people in the Middle Ages, for example, witch burnings happened much later, closer to the Enlightenment.
Right.
There's I think there's like 8 in the Middle Ages. It's actually in the early modern period. But in the early modern period, it starts having this series of wars of religion that are probably very comparable to the wars that we see in Syria today, for example, in Iraq and places like that, where the Shiites and the Sunnis are fighting. Right. It was just like that, but it's Catholics and Protestants, and then this Protestants subdivided into Lutherans and Calvinists and whatnot. As a result, all the really high-level aristocrats that are called princes took advantage of that, and they kind of crushed the lower nobility, they crushed the peasants, and the city-states kind of hunkered down, I guess you would say. A lot of the ones in Italy got taken over. The only one that survived in Italy was Venice in the long run. The rest of them kind of got defeated or conquered by either Spain or France. And in the Low Countries, Spain ended up, through a weird series of events, inheriting a lot of what's now Belgium. So a lot of the people that were there, like a lot of the famous artists, the Flemish masters, moved into Holland, which eventually became a republic. They fought a war of independence against Spain for 80 years called the 80 Years' War. Right. Anyway, that all ended up with what was called the 30 Years' War, which was a horrible, apocalyptic religious war in Europe.
So as a result of war, that's why that broke down.
Yeah, war, ethnic cleansing, genocide, horrible nightmare kind of war thing. It all ended up in this thing called the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, where the new absolute monarchs, that was sort of the new proto-state. So Louis XIV of France, and you had the King of Spain and the King of Sweden and the King of England, and they divided up and they said, okay, we're not going to mess with each other's territory anymore, but we're going to each get to totally own our own territory. So then they start trying to consolidate.
Right.
Consolidation pretty well led to inefficiencies, contrary to what you would expect. So in France, conditions for the peasants went from pretty bad to horrible, to where there was mass starvation. And that's the Louis the 18th, Louis the 16th scenario, where the guillotine comes out and the French Revolution happens.
Right.
And then so that in the French Revolution...
So it wasn't caused by the French Revolution. So when we were discussing this before, I was trying to understand.
Well, yeah, that's kind of one of the arguments that this guy makes, is that during the French Revolution, there was this drive to get rid of all the old stuff. The French call it the Ancien Régime.
Right.
So everything that came before, get rid of the king, but also get rid of a lot of the religious institutions, get rid of a lot of the local...
the local traditions
and the local power centers, good and bad. So it might be like a local bishop or somebody like that, or it might be, a free city. It might be Ghent or Bruges or something like that that's still running their own show. And they wanted to get rid of all of that, centralize everything, get everybody on the same. The free cities, when they would have events, like they would invite people to a shooting contest, they'd have to send them a picture of like how far a foot is for them. Because everyone had a different unit of measure. Right. So things like that seemed very inefficient.
Right.
And copying the Romans, they thought, well, we're going to centralize everything. We're going to get rid of all these regional dialects that everybody speaks. We're going to get rid of that. We're going to have one language. That was the idea anyway. And what this guy's pointing out is that started after the French Revolution. And so you had the Republican, like the sort of pro-revolution faction doing that. And also the counter-revolution faction, like the Prussians,
Right.
who really wanted to make sure they never got conquered by French peasants.
Right.
And they made their own version of that. They made their own centralized state. And the argument this guy's making is that in the aftermath of the French Revolution, there's a project that kind of started and really finished in the 60s. The new country had...
The 1960s.
1960s, yeah. So starting in around the 1820s, like kind of after the French Revolution. And you have the new country, Germany, being created in the 1880s, which in retrospect didn't go that well. Hopefully everything's good there now.
Yeah.
But we had a lot of trouble from the Germans. I'm French, so for me it's three things. It was the Franco-Prussian War, and then World War I, and then World War II.
Right.
And Italy was made into a country, but Italy's had 75 governments since 1945. And they went fascist too. So
right.
That new thing, in theory, they say Mussolini got the trains running on time, but apparently not even true ever, and certainly not after a few years. Like everything, just corruption becomes the main
right.
issue.
You have centralized control, so you have centralized corruption.
Yeah. So the lobbyist or the rich guy, the oligarch, is a lot closer to the ruler than the citizens. So the citizens are much further away today from the people that rule them. I've never met a senator.
Right.
I've never met a congressman. But if you lived in Strasbourg in 1420 and you didn't like what the city was doing with your tax money, you'd go down to City Hall and yell at them.
Right.
And they did that.
So what you're saying is that a citizen actually had more ability to at least be closer to the centers of power.
Yeah, that, and I also think it was much more of an ongoing thing. So like in our country, we think we're very democratic, but we vote every 2 years or something, right?
Right.
And then we just forget about it. We complain, I can't believe it, those jerks did.
Right.
And even on the city level, I see somebody, maybe the Sewage and Water Board, I see 15 guys looking like they're not really working, and there's a big mess, and I'm like, man, the city's got to get on top of this. That's how I look at it, because I'm not really a citizen. But if it was medieval Strasbourg, they'd be like, what the hell are you doing? Get to work. What are you doing standing around?
Right.
There's one guy with a shovel and there's 15 other guys just, my house flooded last week. They wouldn't put up with it. And so they would go to their craft guild,
right.
or they would go to their neighborhood alderman. And we actually had a lot of those kind of institutions, maybe not craft guilds, but we had neighborhood aldermans. We had benevolent associations and stuff, much more in New Orleans even, up until the 50s and 60s.
Is that because of our French connection, maybe?
I think a lot of places had stuff like that. You had your Freemason lodges, and you had your Shriners clubs, and you have religious associations and things like that used to have a little more power. And I'm not really precisely sure exactly why all that stuff went away, but that's kind of the remnant of a more variegated governance that's more accessible. You know? And in theory, we should be able to at least know our city councilors, but partly it's our own fault. We're not used to being citizens. I don't go to city. I don't go to neighborhood association meetings. I should.
Right. So we'll hold up the book for the last few seconds.
There's the book.
Thank you for visiting with us, and thank you, John.
Thanks for having me.